All right, shall I get us started with some penalty chat then? Seeing as I feel
Go
like
on
there
then.
could be quite a bit of that.
Go on then, let's start.
So yes, sort of adding on to the qualifying, then there's a little bit of penalty mess here. So there was a new directive given by Michael Massey ahead of qualifying, and it might have even been ahead of free practice completely. He said any driver intending to create a gap in front of them in order to get a clear lap should not attempt to do this between the entry to turn 9 through to the exit of turn 10.
Which is
And
the
any
last
driver,
two corners.
Yeah. So it's like the last two bit there, and it specifically says the entry to turn 9. So we can
Yep.
assume that as turn 8 ends, that is the entry to turn 9.
Yep.
Any driver seen to have done this will be reported to the stewards. Yeah, that's sometimes felt like that sometimes. Stewards as being in breach of Article 27.4 of the sporting regulations, which, as I'm sure all our listeners know, but yeah, we'll point it out anyway. At no time may a car be driven unnecessarily slowly, erratically, or in a manner which could be deemed potentially dangerous to other drivers or any other person. Okay. So there are two things that come out of this that I'm confused by. Because firstly, after qualifying, we saw that there was a little bit of a train going on, people coalescing into a bit of a tricky group near the end of the track, and Alonso wasn't very happy that he got impeded by Vettel. But it was only Vettel, Sainz, and Bottas that were called to the stewards due to this rule. And also that only Vettel was penalised. When I look into this, I'm a little bit confused by how the ruling has worked here. Because Vettel started his outlap ahead of a whole bunch of cars, but was overtaken by 6 or 7 other cars at least just before getting into turn 9, which I think we could consider the entry to turn 9, because it was after turn 8. So the entry to turn 9, surely.
Yep.
Where they would have had to start speeding up to start their lap proper. Now, Vettel is behind a whole train of cars who have overtaken him in a manner that appears to be on paper at odds with the directive, because they've then had to all slow down in turn 9 and turn 10 because they've all got past each other. There's a big cluster of them. And, you've got all these, each car is backing the other up behind them to some extent. Vettel's now at the end of that train of cars. And up to this point, Vettel is following all of the rules and not breaking any of the sort of supposed gentleman's agreement where you're not supposed to overtake people near the end of the lap. He's like the victim of all of that.
Mm.
At the same time as all this is happening, Alonso is closing fast. We saw he was out in his hot lap. He was putting in some great laps as well. He deserved to be high up. He was doing very well. And there's not long left until the checkered flag. And Vettel can only have a reasonable gap for his hot lap by accelerating properly by the time he gets to turn 10. By which point Fernando's caught up with him, and fortunately any kind of serious accident, is avoided. And Alonso's not happy, but he doesn't blame Vettel personally. Now, after all of that, all these cars bunching together, people overtaking each other, and doing so in an area which appears to be against the rules, is basically going to force them to slow down in an area which will make them against the rules. You've got just Vettel, Bottas, and Sainz being called to the stewards and nobody else. And the ruling was that Bottas and Sainz had breached the directive, but that because there was lots of queuing and too many drivers had contributed to it, they couldn't specifically blame them. Which is to say that they were victims of all the drivers' actions in that train. So doesn't that include Vettel as well?
It really should do, because
he happens to be the one at the back.
Yeah.
So
but
by following the rules, he's now at a disadvantage because he's at the back of the train. And he gets a penalty for that, even though he didn't really do anything wrong and didn't have much of a choice other than abandoning his own lap that he was trying to set. And not only is this situation kind of dangerous because it forces people into doing things like that could be risky, but also it seems impossible for the stewards to be fair or consistent without impeding people during qualifying. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what might be done to avoid these kind of situations in the future.
I don't know what we can do to avoid it. I completely understand why the FIA decided that it was too dangerous to slow down between turns 9 and turns 10, or the entry to turn 9 and the exit of turn 10, because years ago, or in the last couple of years, we have seen cars fly through the third sector, catch a car who's been quite slow between 9 and 10, ready to put the foot down for the final corners, get a great exit. And we've seen cars run wide or had to take evasive action because there's been a car travelling reasonably slow around the final two corners just to try and create that gap. So I completely understand why. the FIA have introduced this. And when I heard the rules through Sky Sports or on Twitter, I thought that's really good safety measure. I criticised the FIA quite a lot for not bringing out safety cars quick enough or making some indecisive decisions, but it was good to see that these rules were being put down. The problem is with Formula One is something which should be quite a simple rule. You put in the hands of teams who are fighting for hundreds of thousands of seconds on their lap, and all of a sudden, something which is quite simple gets made overcomplicated and the rules are completely stretched and people trip over each other. And because so many cars are involved, it's too hard to penalise all of them. So we'll just take the easy one, which is the only car who actually got in the way, and we'll blame him. It had all the best intentions. It really did. But it just wasn't executed well because the Formula One drivers decided to take matters into their own hands and queue a little bit before or overtake just before and try to squeeze some time in. I don't know. It was almost deemed to fail as soon as they mentioned it because these teams will try and do anything to extract a little bit more time. And if they're running late on a lap, they're not going to slow down in accordance with the rules just in case they don't meet the checkered flag. So of course they've done a speed up and overtake. And like you said, unfortunately, Vettel, who was abiding by all the rules and minding his own business, who was set up for a perfect lap up until 3 corners before the final corner, happened to be overtaken by, half a dozen cars or just less than half a dozen cars, and then was victim to his own selflessness.